grateful and thankful to Lea Ypi to be joining us tonight at the Croatian National Theater in Rijeka. I'll just give a very brief introduction and then we'll immediately start with a conversation, and you will have, as usual, an opportunity from the audience to pose questions and discuss together with us. So Lea Ypi is a professor of political theory at London School of Economics. She published books such as Global Justice and Avant-Garde Political Agency, The Meaning of Partisanship, The Architectonic of Reason, and Free, with the subtitle Coming of Age at the End of History, which is a book which has by now been translated into more than 35 languages. And luckily, just these days, it has been published into Croatian. So you can see it here. You can also add, I have to say it immediately because I know you love to read books. You can find it there at the entrance of the theater, and after the event, Lea will be signing signatures if you want to add dedication. So this book just came out, and it's a book on Lea's and Lea's family journey from socialism to post-socialism, a topic which I think is quite familiar here. Immediately as it was published, it became a bestseller, earned a lot of awards, many reviews, and this will also be the main topic of our tonight's conversation, because I'm not so sure how many people here in Croatia have read the book yet. So it will also be an introduction to the book and an introduction to the thought of Lea Ypi. We met, I think, for the first time and last time 2 years ago in Barcelona. And that was the first time I have read the book, just before we met in Barcelona. And then during our public discussion at CCCB and later at dinner, what made me think was really, the book really made me think, I think that's the precious thing of this book, not just for us in Croatia today, but also in many other places. It made me think also about my own childhood. It made me think about the childhood in socialism, in post-socialism transition, with all the differences, of course, between the Albanian experience of socialism and the Yugoslav experience of socialism. And now I have read the book again before you came, and I can really say this is one of the best memoirs which emerged in the Balkans in the last decades. Not just in the Balkans, because I think it's a great book because it succeeds to do what great memoirs succeed to do, which is to arrive from the personal to the general to the common, and from the singular to the universal, with all the differences which we might find there. So, yeah, first of all, welcome to Rijeka. Really glad to have you here.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for joining, and thank you, Srećko, for those kind words.
So my first question, I mean, I start, from kind of basics. Are you surprised by the success of the book?
Yeah, I am. It was a big surprise. I was hoping for 1 or 2 good reviews,
but you got like thousands.
Yeah.
Okay, but the book came out in 2001 by Penguin originally, and as I said, in the meantime, it was translated in 35 languages. So I can assume you did like hundreds of events already connected to the book. Do you ever feel bored talking about it again and again?
No, because I think that the work of the book is not finished when the book is finished writing, but it continues with audiences. And so just as audiences change and readers change and contexts, both historical and political change, the reception is different, and I feel that you keep learning, and sometimes I feel that the writer also doesn't have full grasp of what they were trying to say, and they only get that in connection to audiences and to readers. And because the readership is always different, the languages are different, the public is different, that work continues. So it's like, asking a director, do you ever get bored of playing the same sonata? Well, it's different in different contexts. So.
Yeah. So let's start from I don't know how much you can see from the audience, probably nothing, right? But you can see, I would love to start from the cover of the book and then to unpack it a bit and travel inside of the book and its topics and repercussions, because most of all covers in these 35 languages have a very similar image. There are small differences between the English one and the Croatian one. On the Croatian one, you can find you know it well, but I'm explaining it to you. You can find a television, and on the television you can find a can of Coca-Cola on the television placed as a sort of shrine. I know this also sounds familiar to all the generations in Croatia who lived during socialist Yugoslavia, who always also had something on the television, and also this, I don't know how you call this little...
In Albanian we call it centro. I don't know.
Yeah, here pleter, I think. I don't know the... tabletić, da. Older generations know it very well. Anyhow, here on the book you can see a can of Coca-Cola. So, can you tell us what does this iconic image tell us about socialism in Albania and your childhood in Albania?
So this is very funny because this tableta you said in Albanian it's called centro. This is something that my mother, every time she visits me in London, she insists on bringing me one of those. And it's so I always feel the obligation to expose it somewhere, but it doesn't quite fit in London household, so it's a bit of a challenge. That image is connected to a chapter in the book which is called Coca-Cola Cans, in which I talk about my childhood in communist Albania, and in this particular chapter I talk about a fight between my mother and a neighbor over an empty Coca-Cola can. So these, I don't know if you had the same in former Yugoslavia, but in Albania Coca-Cola cans were markers of social status. So if you had one exposed on your television, it meant that someone from the family at some point had traveled in the West and brought evidence of that journey. And the episode that I narrate in the book is one where we had these neighbors, where we shared everything, we had very close social connection, they had the keys to our house, they looked after me when I was absent. But the only fight that I actually remember, a very, really violent fight between my mother and this neighbor, was over this Coca-Cola can. And the story went as follows. My mother was a teacher. She had bought the can, obviously second-hand, so empty can, from a colleague in her school, and she had brought it in our house and proudly displayed it on our television. And a couple of days after, the can disappeared and reappeared on the neighbor's television. And this was the very first and only time in which my mother accused the neighbor of stealing from us, because, you know, they had the keys, they could go in and out, it was like family. And then eventually I was very upset by this episode, and the whole chapter is about me trying to mediate between these two families fighting each other and making sure that they would reconcile. But the reason it's there in that part of the book is to talk on the one hand about this network of solidarity and these connections that we had with people in society and how they helped each other in hardships, and whenever there was scarcity, or when you had a wedding and you needed something, you'd go to your neighbor, or when there was a funeral and you needed a lot of chairs, you'd go to your neighbor. And so this very, very close network of solidarity in society. And on the other hand, about the fact that this Coca-Cola, which was the symbol of the West, in a way was a kind of symbol also because it was a gesture of everyday resistance to the regime. It was a way of saying to people, you don't tell me what I expose on my living room. And it usually stood next to a photograph of Enver Hoxha, so our communist leader in Albania. So you'd have the Coca-Cola can right next to the Enver Hoxha photo. And this was again a way of basically, for me, exploring the contradictions of living in this communist society where you had all these different strange things going on, which now, after many, many years, seem very weird and contradictory and don't really make sense.
Although your family never had a photo of Enver Hoxha, right, at the television, but we'll come there later to the reasons of this. I would again come back to the cover. And to the subtitle, because the subtitle of the cover says a lot, I think. In Croatian it says Odrastanje na kraju povijesti, and in English it's coming of age at the end of history. I guess many people here in the room know about Francis Fukuyama. It was also a very influential theory in the 90s during the period of transition in Croatia. This thesis that with liberal democracy, we are reaching an end of fighting struggling ideologies, and liberal democracy is the winner in town. Do you recall when
for the first time you have read Fukuyama. When was that? And why did this text, which was published by Fukuyama in 1989, trigger you in a way that much that you put it in the subtitle?
Yeah, so the first time was when I was studying philosophy in Italy back in the mid-90s, and you know, Fukuyama was everywhere and this discussion around the end of history was everywhere. But then I remember returning to these texts at some point and reading a sentence, which was the sentence that in a footnote that really triggered me. And it was in the context of me reading about history and Hegelian approaches to history and this, you know, connection that Fukuyama explicitly builds to Hegel and this understanding of philosophy of history and eras that replace one another. And at one point there was in this text, Fukuyama considers a criticism. And the criticism is, well, you know, how do we know what is history? Who makes history? And in examining this criticism, which goes along with this thesis that you have just explained, there is a wonderful paragraph in which he discusses history as made by, you know, big, powerful countries and sort of irrelevant history. And in the context of irrelevant history, there's this paragraph where he says, of course, if we want to know whether liberalism really succeeded, we don't ask the people of Burundi or Albania. And this was the triggering sentence for me, because I thought, well, maybe you should ask the people of Albania what they think about the end of history. And that sentence, which was the, you know, the provocation from Fukuyama, was what prompted me to write this basically first-hand account of what it meant to grow up in this transition from communism to capitalism, and to think about ideas of freedom as you go through this transition, both from an individual perspective, but also from a collective perspective.
Let's talk a bit before we come into the various topics which you cover about the origins or the origin of the book. So you're teaching at London School of Economics. You're an academic, you publish several academic books, mainly dealing with Kant, but also with colonialism, migration, and so on. And one day, if I recall well, or I read it somewhere, you've been invited by the publisher Penguin to write a non-fiction book, you know, this kind of general audience, theoretical books for a general audience on the topic of freedom. And it turned out to be a best-selling auto-fiction memoir. I know that very often you describe it as a natural process, but I'm curious in which way, you know, how do you end up from academic writing into this kind of writing, and at which point, I know because the main idea was to conceptualize freedom, at which point did it turn into fiction? You know, how did this process look like, and when did the characters appear, and your own experience and so on?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and in a way the answer to that question is a lot about the contingency of the writing and the particular timing in which I was undertaking this work. So it's true that I was asked to write a book about freedom, and one of the things that I wanted to write about was the fact that many people tend to think of socialism and liberalism as opposite traditions of political thought. So some people think liberalism is about freedom and socialism is about equality. And throughout my academic work, I had been convinced that actually socialism is a radicalization of the idea of freedom that you find in the liberal tradition, that there isn't really this opposition between these two traditions, that in fact what the socialist tradition says is if you really want freedom, these are the kinds of freedoms that you need to have a flourishing society. And so the book was going to be this basically theoretical, philosophical analysis. Now, the one thing that gave the kind of personal twist was that I had agreed to write this book during COVID. And I was in Berlin during the lockdown, where all the libraries closed and the universities were shut, the conferences were all suspended, and academic activities in general were just cancelled. And I was in this flat in Berlin on a research fellowship for 1 year with 3 children. So I had small children at that time. All 3 of them were at home and were running around looking for me. The youngest was 1, so they were 1, 3, and 7, something like that.
Sounds like fun.
And so in order to escape from these 3 children, I basically locked myself in a cupboard to write. And, you know, it was a big cupboard because it was a German cupboard, but it was still a cupboard. And there was something, I remember thinking, there was something really strange writing about freedom from a cupboard. In this capital of Europe, which everyone thought, you know, this is where the European Union, Germany is the heart of the European Union, this is where freedom is at, where everything is happening. And in the meantime, I was constantly being chased by these 3 people who were trying to find me, and who couldn't play in the playground because the playground was closed, it was literally taped and you couldn't access, you couldn't go to nursery, you couldn't go to school. And I thought at that point that there's some moments in history where history with a capital H and history with a small h actually become the same thing. And as I tried to process this thought, and also the constant interruptions from the kids who were, they eventually didn't know I was in the cupboard, but before I found the cupboard, they were in the bath, they were in the bedroom, they were everywhere. I remember thinking that there had been another time of my life where it felt exactly the same, where you have macro history and micro history, and the way you experience it in your daily life is exactly the same as what the nation, the country is going through, and in my case in COVID, the whole world seemed to be going through, and these discussions around what is freedom, how do we think about freedom. So that made me somehow unintentionally veer into this much more personal writing, where I started to write about freedom in the liberal and socialist tradition, and all the ideas that I wanted to write about suddenly became people and characters and noises and images, colors, so all the sort of literary devices that then the book recurs to render this.
Let's talk a bit more about these people who are very dear people to you, and it's your family, and without them, actually, we wouldn't have this book on the table tonight. So, also through the characters, through your family, I mean, just maybe, I'm sorry if I'm retelling in a very bad way the book, but just for those who didn't read it yet, and hopefully they will buy the book afterwards. So, you grew up in a family which, from your perspective, was a typical communist family who loved Uncle Enver Hoxha. Okay, you always waited for that picture of Enver Hoxha to be near the Coca-Cola can on the television, but your parents constantly found excuses that it will come another day and so on. You also lived in a family of intellectuals with a long history which you didn't know about yet. And then with the collapse of communism and the system of Enver Hoxha, you were, I think, 10 or 11, you suddenly realized that everything you believed in is not true, that your whole family actually, they weren't good communists. On the opposite, your whole family was a dissident family. Your grandfather was 15 years in prison, your father was in prison. There is also, I mean, I don't know whether I can tell it or not because I'm spoiling the book. I won't spoil it, but all the time your family talks about family relatives who had been at one university or graduating something and so on. But in the end, it turns out, I'm spoiling now, I'm sorry, that was just a code name.
No, don't spoil it.
Okay, you will see it once you read the book. But anyhow, so your whole world turns upside down when you're at a very young age and with the collapse. And it's exactly what you say, the history with a small age becomes history with age, with a big age. Could you tell us a bit more about that for those who don't know? And also maybe unpack a bit what kind of concepts of freedom are embodied in the different characters, in your father, in your mother, in your grandmother.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing to say, I guess, is that when I was growing up in communism, I knew there was something strange about my family, but I wasn't quite able to pin down what it was. And the first thing, that this is a very early memory, the first thing that was very strange was that I grew up speaking French to my grandmother. I was raised by my grandmother mainly. My parents were, typical communist state employees. My mother was a teacher, my father was an engineer in a kind of remote village. And so I was mostly being looked after by my grandmother, who insisted on speaking French to me. And every time, from day one, so it was my first language. And every time I asked her, why are we speaking French? Because she wasn't French. She spoke French with an accent. She had no relatives in France. She'd actually never been to France. And this is something that I knew as a child, because I would ask her, do you know? And it was clear that her connection to France was just from books and culture. She would come up with completely random reasons, like, but you liked France, don't you? Or you've read The Misérables, you've read Cosette, or things like, Enver Hoxha also taught French in a school, so what's wrong with speaking French? Or French is the language of the French Revolution. And somehow, a child always knows that, can tell when an adult is not quite playing it straight, even though they can't immediately say that they're lying or that they're being somehow misled in some dimension. And it turned out only when communism collapsed that the reason my grandmother spoke French to me is that she had grown up in Ottoman Salonika. Well, it was already Greek, but it was an Ottoman city at the point in which she was growing up, from a kind of Ottoman elite family where French, just like with the Russian elites of the 19th century, was a lingua franca. So this was a lingua franca of the aristocracy in the interwar period. And for her, in a way, France was a way of keeping her identity, but an identity that was a class identity rather than a national identity, because that's how she felt and that's who she was. And in a way, teaching me French was the way of transmitting this identity that had absolutely no place in communist Albania, because I, for my part, was a pioneer, had become a pioneer early because of my great effort at school, and was very excited to be a pioneer, and loved Enver Hoxha, Uncle Enver, as we used to call him, was completely convinced that Albania was the freest country in the world, even though there was a lot of hardship. And so you knew that you couldn't travel abroad outside Albania. You knew that you couldn't find all the goods that people would find in the West, because we used to have films sometimes shown from the West, and so you knew what supermarket looks like in a capitalist country and what it looks like in a communist country, and that one you go and pick stuff and in the other you don't have anything. And so all of these things were normalized to a child by saying, yes, but this is the cost of freedom. This is what it means to defend your country. And we were, as it happens, and this was very empowering for a child, to have this image of these great superpowers that this tiny country like Albania is fighting. You know, the Soviet Union on the one hand, the United States on the other hand, so imperialism on the one hand, revisionism on the other. Yugoslavia wasn't much better as far as we were concerned. So we were this kind of tiny nation that was basically fighting everyone, and in the name of freedom had to make all these sacrifices. And this is what prompted me to think about freedom, and this is partly the kind of red thread that runs through the book, is to try and think about this distinction between freedom as an ideal and freedom as an ideology. The freedom that we think that we're committed to for the right reasons, and the freedom that someone is always telling us this is what it actually really is. And in communist Albania, this was the freedom of communism, that all, including children, had to make an effort. And so through the characters of the book, to go back to your second question, the book is an exploration of how each of these characters in my family had a different idea of freedom, and in different social systems, in communism first and in capitalism after, it looks very, very different. My mother has a much more liberal, sort of Thatcherite, libertarian idea. My father has a more social idea. My grandmother has a much more kind of inner freedom conception, but the characters and the dialogues and the plot is a way of rendering these conflicts of freedom.
In one of the chapters, which is called Letter from Athens, I think is the second part of the book, you mentioned your first travel to Greece with your grandmother, and that was the point when your grandmother tells you to start writing a diary and just start writing down what you see there. And I think it's one of them. I mean, there are many, many parts I could mention, but it's very interesting because from a perspective of a child, you get a kind of, literally a list of the things, of the differences between capitalism or liberal democracy and socialism. How much did you rely on diaries for writing the book? And for how long did you write a diary? Do you still write a diary?
No, I stopped a while ago, but I did write for a very long time. I started when I was about 11, so in exactly this moment when the system fell and I decided that I had to somehow record these experiences, and my grandmother had encouraged me and I wanted to be a writer. And then I stopped, I think, a few years ago. But throughout 1990s, which is the period that I write about, in the, especially in the second half of the book, I had daily entries of this experience. And with the earlier childhood, I didn't have diaries, but I had a lot of symbols that I remembered that were very vividly marked in my mind. So, you know, the death of Enver Hoxha, for example, was one where I was only almost 6, but this was such a strong experience for a child to suddenly, I was at nursery, and I remember when I went to nursery, I don't know if you've had this same experience when Tito died here.
I
but you
personally didn't, but people here
But
cried.
you know, you'd go to nursery and people will say, you know, this terrible thing has happened, the leader of our nation is dead. And on the other hand, because we didn't have religion and had communism, you also had to reassure people about this. And so the fact that there was one person dying, you still have to believe that that the party continues and you continue the work, and there is a kind of collective force mobilizing behind this. So there were moments about the communist childhood that were really in my memory very, very strongly marked, and then I had to rely on, you know, videos, returning to newspapers, trying to find what the documentary evidence around the period, and I reconstructed then the lived experience with the help of these other
That's what I wanted to ask. How much did you rely on? Then you watched, for instance, videos of the funeral of Enver Hoxha, this kind of stuff.
And there you have a kind of Proustian Madeleine moment. You know, you're reliving something that you clearly lived as a child, and it all completely comes back to you suddenly, and you feel almost the feelings return. And
yeah, I think one of these moments, I mean, for me, that was my Madeleine reading the book, is the moment when you're watching the last Eurovision contest where Yugoslavia participated. I guess many of you know it wasn't just Tajci, Hajde da ludujemo, that was our entry, our Yugoslav, whatever. But there was, the winner was Toto Cutugno, Insieme, Unite Europe. And that was, I think, May 1990. It happened in Zagreb. And you were watching it, right? Because you watched Yugoslav television. Can you tell us more, how did you, and we'll come to Yugoslavia in a bit as well, how did you feel when you watched, because I think it kind of also explains the book, how previously you believed in a system, and then later transition comes slowly. So when you...
so for us, so first of all, we always watched Eurovision through the Italian channels. And so it was the window to everything that went outside Albania. There were two windows in Albania. One was Yugoslav television and the other was Italian television. And with Yugoslav, it was more complicated because only my father spoke, I can't remember now which of the languages he spoke, one of them. And but he would translate live, so even films or even news or whatever, he would just kind of sit and the rest of the family would listen to him as he was translating. And with Italian, I didn't really, at the time I wasn't really studying Italian, but it was Eurovision, you just somehow sit there and pick up. And what struck me about that Toto Cutugno song was that this was a time in which Albania was still a communist country. But this song, Unite Europe, was all about the Maastricht Treaty that was kind of being in the works and the creation of the European Union and these ideas of solidarity. And there is this amico che sei lontano, this idea of this friend who was in the other side of the Iron Curtain and that now needed to be reunited. And in my head, I had completely misinterpreted this because I was still completely in the ideology of communist Albania. So whenever he said sempre più liberi noi, we are always more and more free, I always thought, yeah, sure, this is freedom through communism. When in fact he was extolling the virtues of the European Union and the free market and this making of the sort of common Europe. And this is this operation went on for me at least throughout the early 1990, 1991, up to the point where it was very clear that a system was dead and a new system was being replaced by this. And this, again, I have a very vivid memory of the General Secretary of the Communist Party coming out and saying, from now on, Albania will be a plural, democratic, liberal republic and not a socialist republic anymore. And I was completely struck because I thought, well, what's wrong with what we had before? And I think this was the experience of many children, a lot of people who were exactly coming of age around the same period, where we just didn't really understand what was going on. It was just very clear that something fundamental had changed and that there was a big rupture. But how you analyzed and how you thought of that rupture was really difficult, including generationally difficult, because there was a generation of people who had really wanted this to happen and an entire generation who just couldn't relate to it in any way because they haven't been given the tools to think about it.
Before we come back or move forwards to 91 and to the period of transition, just to remain a bit on the Yugoslav terrain, it's interesting to see, your father who watches sports, mainly basketball at that time, which was pretty huge and successful in socialist Yugoslavia. But also there is one sentence which says, if it was a commercial for personal hygiene, my father would immediately shout, reklama, reklama. Yeah. And then he would translate and so on. So I'm not that much interested in the differences between Yugoslav socialism and Albanian socialism and going back to the history and Stalin and, you know, your division from Stalin and our division, no to Stalin and so on. I'm more interested in your relationship towards socialist Yugoslavia. So obviously for your father, it was a better sort of socialism where at least you could have some products, you could move, because, you know, at that time with the Yugoslav passport, and unlike with the Albanian one, you could really travel abroad and so on. But how did you perceive Yugoslavia at that time and also when the war started?
Because so for me it was two things that we didn't have in Albania. One was the Maya B. The Maya B.
Aha, Pčelca Maja. Aha, yeah, okay, thanks.
And the other one was Popeye.
Popeye also.
Yeah, so these two we didn't have in Albania, and I could only watch them on Yugoslav television. My father had the basketball, of course, like all the sort of sport dimension. Then there was this film that was not in Albanian television at all, and indeed was sort of, people were embarrassed to confess that they were watching. It's called Elektriku Blue, so Blue Electric, which was some kind of soft porn. I mean, not porn, but like erotic movie. And then the other one was Lepa Prena. So these are the only bits of kind of Yugoslav popular culture that were very, very present in Albania, and that everyone, and in our case, as I say, the television, and then the commercials were the other thing. So we didn't have commercials in Albania. This was not part of what the state was after. And so whenever, this is a scene that I describe in the book, and the commercials only came from Yugoslav television for some reason. Whenever there was, because I don't know why, but whenever they were on Italian television, they were censored. But the Yugoslav ones were not censored for reasons that I don't know. And so whenever there was this commercial, my father would shout from the kitchen, "Reclama, reclama," and everyone would go and watch this as this was a kind of real film. And again, I only remember this experience of seeing these, beautiful women wash their hands or wash their hair and display something. And it just felt like an image of a completely different world that we had no connection to.
Did you see then as a child Yugoslavia more as a capitalist country?
Yeah, I think, I mean, not as a capitalist country, but just as different as the rest of the world was from Albania. Of course, in the case of Yugoslavia, it was also very complicated because the history of the creation of the Albanian Communist Party is very connected to the Yugoslav Communist Party. So we wouldn't actually have had a Communist Party in Albania if the Yugoslavs had not been encouraging the formation of this unit. And so the very first years of communism, and indeed the Albanian partisans in 1944-45 were also fighting in Yugoslavia. After they liberated Albania, they went to fight. So this was part of our national history, that, you had this communist party that was created with the help of Yugoslavs that had fought in Yugoslavia, that the Yugoslavs had helped Albania, and then Albanians had helped the Yugoslavs. And then something went wrong with the Tito-Stalin split, and that was the point where we decided that the Yugoslavs kind of sold out, and we decided to keep the great communism that we had. And so this was very present in the storytelling, in the national narrative. So I also had grown up with this idea that this country maybe had something to do with communism at one point, but they weren't real communists. They were a bit kind of wishy-washy and, not very serious.
Unlike you, the Albanians. Okay, so in 1991, you have the collapse of the regime. You have the first democratic elections, like we had, I think, a year before in Croatia. So we can also follow some similar processes. In what way does that represent a rupture, a break between the convictions you had before, and how did this moment, in which ways did it teach you to understand both the wrongdoings of socialism and liberal democracy? Because obviously also we mentioned Fukuyama already. In late communist Albania, also in late communist or socialist Yugoslavia, there was this great aspiration of freedom in a very general way, abstract way, which was mainly connected, we mentioned it already, to the free market, to the possibility of choice, and then very quickly sliding into consumerism and so on. But everyone at that moment, the majority was excited that, there is pluralism, democracy, you can vote for more than one party and so on. But what did make you consider also liberal democracy as something which also has flaws, which also has problems, not in the same way as socialism, but, how did this rupture influence your understanding also of, and disillusionment of liberal democracy quite early on, I would say? Yeah, I mean, so I think there were several experiences. The first one with the elections, the one that really struck me was the fact that we had grown up in an atheist country. So Albania was explicitly atheist. We had destroyed the mosques and the churches in the late 70s. And, I had grown up with this completely non-religious worldview. And suddenly in 1990, when the regime changed, we were also told that now you could also have religion.
But it's very strange to have religion in a place where you haven't had religion before. It's as though it's really hard to kind of insert God, just as it's if you've grown up without the idea of God. And I remember thinking and talking to one of my friends about the elections, and she was saying to me, you know, now there is Christmas and there is Ramadan and there's all these kind of religious festivities, and there's also the free elections. And somehow I had associated this idea that when you voted in elections, you also voted to decide which God was better, whether it was the Christian God or the Muslim God or the Greek Orthodox God. And also at that time, I remember asking adults, and they were saying, no, God is not about what you vote about, which God is right. So somehow it was all completely muddled in my head. So this is the lighter experience. The part where it started to become really, really dark is actually through the 90s, first with the waves of mass emigration from Albania. And I grew up in Durrës on the Adriatic coast, which was the first port from which Albanians would leave to hijacking boats and just landing in Italy by the tens of thousands. And so suddenly this city was completely depleted of people, and literally everyone I knew either had left or wanted to leave, and it was just a question of how you would leave rather than whether you would leave at all or not. It was more about, do you falsify a visa, or do you ask for a passport, or do you get the boat, or do you cross the border with Greece? So this experience of emigration was, I think, really formative. And the discourse around emigration, the fact that again, something that I had remembered was that everybody who had left communist Albania was considered a hero in the West. You know, these were dissidents that would come to tell the truth about this system that was flawed in many ways. And suddenly, from one day to the other, those very dissidents became criminals. They became illegal immigrants. They became people that you had to worry about. There was, in Italian television, the rhetoric against Albanians had completely changed from one day to the other, which, again, made you think about this ideology around freedom, and so how someone is always packaging border crossing as either an act of heroism or an act of violation of fundamental norms, and why are people leaving their houses. And the other thing that also changed for me and was really important personally was that in communism we had all these clubs, you know, after school clubs, literature, maths, there were lots of activities. And because of the state resources completely going down, these were all cancelled. So there was basically nothing to do. It was the 90s for me were really, really dark, because you came from school, there was no electricity often, and you just couldn't do anything. So you couldn't go anywhere, you couldn't meet a friend, you couldn't go out. This was the beginning also of women young girls being kidnapped and sold into sex trafficking in Italy, or you'd meet the wrong guy and he would just somehow lie to you and take you. And this is one of the stories I tell of one of my friends from school who ends up being a sex worker. And so you just couldn't do anything. And on top of that, not only you could not do anything, but you could also not complain about it, because with my family, every time I try to say, you know, this is horrible, there's nothing to do, they would say, your grandfather spent 15 years in a communist prison and fought for this freedom, and now you're so ungrateful. So there was a real generational gap also in terms of how you experience freedom and how you think about this new world, where not only was I not feeling happy, but I also felt every time I tried to complain about not being happy, told completely patronized and talked down by my family, who thought that this was someone who is growing up arrogant and not understanding all the opportunities that they have. So there was a real, I think, generational divide as well that emerged and became more and more sharp in the 90s.
Exactly at that period, in March 1991, an Italian team from the Rai television comes to Durrës, or Drace as we call it, and they find a group of young children on the streets, and you're one among them, you're 11 or something, and they want to make an interview with the children. You offer them to translate it for them, but instead of taking an interview with them, they start to interview you, and you can find that cute video on the internet. I rewatched it, and you say, they ask you something, and you say that when you grow up you want to be a writer because you like it, but then you also add that being a president is also not bad. So you became a writer, a very successful writer. This book also became pretty influential, I would say, among politicians. One among them is the current, but today, I mean, I don't know whether you know, today it's the Albanian elections taking place. And Edi Rama is running for his 4th term. And I've read somewhere that, I mean, I also saw it on social networks and so on. Wherever Edi Rama goes, he brings your book and gives it to the other politicians. Obviously, it also had an impact on Albania. But my question is more going back to the young Lea Ypi. You are a writer now. Do you feel any temptation to become a politician? And have there been any kind of proposals and so on? Or, you know, do you think that, you know, out of this whole experience and seeing the flaws of both socialism and liberal democracy, do you ever feel tempted, yeah, maybe I should go into that direction of this kind of classical politics, representative politics, running for office or whatever? Did that, obviously it crossed your mind, I don't know, but...
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely crossed my mind, but I feel that now I think more of politics as a trap, or at least representative, so this kind of professional politics of the kind that we are exposed to. I guess this is the naivety of the child, is that in the 90s I thought that if you were a president or if you're a prime minister, you could really make a difference. And the way I think about politics now, and especially actually elected representatives, so people who hold political power, I think of them as being much more constrained than we think they are. Because, you know, they're constrained by the market, they're constrained by the polls, they're constrained by the public, they're constrained by the reception. And so this idea that you actually enter politics to make a difference seems to me to be a very superficial approach. And so even though it's very tempting to think of it, because obviously we think this is where power lies, you know, in the prime minister, in the president, in the states, actually in the contemporary globalized world, states, and especially states like Albania, have very, very little power. And it's very, very difficult to really make a mark and to make a difference, because mostly you are at the mercy of these stronger states that decide what should happen. And, you know, even we saw for Greece, in the case of the Eurozone, what the limits of a state-elected power is and how much you can actually do, even when you have a very strong popular mandate. So I suppose I've started to think in a very different way about what it means to have power and to have influence and for ideas to make a difference. And of course it's very tempting, it's very attractive, it's very rewarding from a personal perspective to think, you know, if I go there, if I get elected, then I really make a difference. But to be completely honest, I don't think that is the case. I think if I was elected, I would just enter a mechanism and I would be just a cogwheel in a machine, and the machine kind of keeps grinding and doing its work, and you're just there pushing it in the way in which it goes anyway. And so I feel sometimes that maybe there is more power in the world of ideas and art and discussions and deliberation, and actually in some ways more capacity to move people and to be moved back than if you're in this very strict world of electoral politics where you just have to play a certain kind of game, and if you don't play the game, you're out. And I'm not really sure that there is much more freedom there. So I think of it more as a trap than as a space of asserting yourself.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one proof besides Edi Rama, I mean, there have been many from the European Council, European Commission, making photos with your book on the table and so on. But just before the last German elections, right, you had a public debate with the then German Chancellor of the SPD, the German Social Democrats, Olaf Scholz. And I found it remarkable because it proves what you just said, which is that, yeah, by writing a book, and precisely this kind of book, you can actually influence people. But I also had the impression that during that, which is what was a fascinating conversation, but that during the conversation, I'm not so sure, to use your phrase now, that you moved him and that he moved you back, in a way. For instance, at the beginning of the discussion, I mean, he at the beginning says he loved the book, and when the moderator asks him, did you see any similarities between this Albanian experience and Eastern Germany? And he just says, no, and doesn't add anything else. And I mean, if this Olaf Scholz didn't see any similarities, I don't know which book he read. But my question is, and then of course you have Streitgespräch, as they would say in German, which means that it's a very good debate on concepts of democracy and so on. But I think from my perspective, of course, we can immediately see the flaws of social democracy and liberal democracy. So my question is more about, not about him exactly, I don't care about Olaf Scholz, but about social democracy. And why are you that critical of social democracy? And then what's the connection with liberalism as well? And why do you think that today this is not the exact response to the polycrisis we are facing?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Just to start with the debate, what was really interesting for me about that debate is that you actually have two individuals that start really wanting to have a debate, and then you realize, just at what I said earlier, that one of them is free and the other is not. And the one who is not because they have a certain brief. So they need to say certain things to be elected. They need to communicate certain things to the public. And any mistake they made, not necessarily because they want to, but there is a risk that it will be misinterpreted and it will be played against them. And so in a way, that's what made me realize that the life of the intellectual has much more freedom, although maybe also less responsibility, because you're only responsible to yourself. And so you can say whatever you like. In a way, it doesn't really matter. People give your book. I often have the worry that, people give your book and invite you to things just because they want to signal that they are inviting and hearing another voice and hearing a criticism, but they don't actually care. They're not going to be moved, and it's just a show. And so you're in the end inadvertently reproducing this as well. So I think there's a lot of kind of moral dilemmas around that question. So that's just the more personal part. About social democracy, I suppose social democracy was really promising when it emerged in the early 20th century, because it offered a compromise between these different social groups and the conflict between these social groups, and it promised that through citizenship and through democratic participation and through an attempt to mediate between these different interests in society, you would really get representation. So every vote would count, every voice would count, and you would really have democracy. And then you realize that when you're up against something like capitalism, which is a global structure, this is an illusion, because no matter what a small state or even a group of states does, the forces of the market are such that your agency is gone from the state. And so I guess in my work, I've now come to realize that you can't really have national social democracy, because yes, you can make small improvements, but then in a way it doesn't really matter whether you're a progressive liberal or a social democrat or a socialist. Anyone can make those kind of technical policy-based improvements. But what you can't really do is fundamentally change the balance of power in such a way that you shelter, that you secure democracy. Democracy is always vulnerable to capitalist pressure. And depending on how this fight goes, it can go one way or it can go the other. It went in favor of social democracy for maybe the second half of the 20th century. So you had 1960s, 70s, collective bargaining and pressure on capital and concessions to workers, and therefore some equality, which then also encouraged some democratic representation. And we see it now where it's completely gone the other way, where you just don't have that balance, is completely destroyed. Workers have no representation. The fact that they are disenfranchised, disaffected, gets manipulated by the right and therefore then pitted and put in the service of a very regressive anti-foreigner, anti-migrant project. So this is all the balance of, this is why I sometimes get nervous when people talk about neoliberalism, because I think neoliberalism is just a phase of capitalism. Then there's a social democratic phase, then there's a fascist phase. There are different stages that follow one another depending on how this relationship between the market and the state develops. And that's where I've lost my faith in social democracy, because now we understand it as mainly a national project. But as a national project, it's completely limited by the fact that it's a national project up against a transnational phenomenon.
Okay, so it's not social democracy, it's not liberalism, it's also not socialism of the type of Albania. What is it then? I mean, even after all this family trajectory, and I won't spoil again the end of the book, but you decide to study philosophy, and with a focus on Karl Marx, which of course your parents didn't quite like at that moment. And that's your academic work, and very serious academic work. So we're moving a bit away from the book. But my question is: so if it's not social democracy, it's not liberalism, it's not that kind of socialism, what is it then? What kind of freedom and democracy are you aspiring towards? And is it possible to create it in circumstances of today?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so first the easier answer, whether it's possible, sure, everything is possible. We are free human beings, and I think, you know, we create the world that we want to create. So on that front, I think I'm less worried about this question about the feasibility of proposals, because I think in world history, we have seen that even things that seemed completely unfeasible and impossible get realized if there is a right political will. So the question is there political will, and can you mobilize enough people to try and support these visions? And that's where the work gets much more complicated and much longer. I mean, I call my version moral socialism because it's a way, it's an effort to think about socialism that tries to learn from these collapses of state socialism in the 20th century, and also from the collapses of capitalism. And so we are facing this double failure. And part of the reason why I was really interested and began to become engaged with Marx, apart from just wanting to annoy my parents when I went to university, is actually I grew up in Albania and then I studied in Italy, and was actually being exposed to this very different way of thinking about Marx in the East and in the West of Europe, where in Eastern Europe, you know, Marx is just history. And it's not just history, it's lived history. It's the lived experience of people whose relatives were sent to prison, who were shunned from work, who were persecuted for one reason or another, who were censored, cancelled. So in that world, only the history matters, their history. And philosophy is just, you know, something that people read and discuss, but they don't really know what it really is. And this is the first experience I have when I try to talk about these ideas in Albania, and probably also in any post-communist country. The reaction you get is, oh, we know this, we've seen this, we've done it, we've tried it, it's failed, it's not worth going there. And in the West, it's very different, because the relationship to Marxism and to socialism is very different. It's almost as though only the ideas matter. So it's only the philosophy. The history is always the history of some kind of stupid, crazy people out there who tried to do this, but they clearly didn't get it right because they didn't really know how to do it, and because they didn't have the right tradition and they didn't have the right ideas. And so it's just these beautiful concepts of, you know, this communist world that we haven't seen yet because no one's actually realized it and no one's tried to do anything about it other than these backwards people that we don't have to worry about. So this actually generated in me discomfort, because it's really hard to say to people like my parents, or I'm sure people who are here as well tonight, that 50 years of your life that were under the banner of Karl Marx and socialism don't matter. It doesn't matter. You know, this is not, you got it wrong. You didn't know what you were doing. This is all stupid. Let's try it all from scratch and we will tell you how to do it. I think it's profoundly disrespectful and just doesn't resonate with people. So it seems to me that there's a real need to grapple with this experience of state socialist failure. On the other hand, I think also the West would benefit from knowing about this experience, but the East would also benefit from having some faith that, you know, maybe there was something to this world, maybe there was something to this critique of capitalism, maybe there were some analytical truths there that we should just go back and revisit. And part of my effort to recover some of the Marxist tradition is being exactly that, to kind of go back and say, well, what does this tradition tell us about the world in which we live now that is still valuable and still instructive, that teaches us about the contradictions of the societies in which we live? There's some... No one is a hero. I don't really care about Marx particularly myself, other than as a tool for thinking about the world in which we live. But maybe, you know, this passage was too quick. So I suppose I think of the future as a learning process, as an effort to engage with these two collapses, without really saying, well, this collapse was much more than this other collapse, it was much worse, and so let's not go there, but let's preserve and make this one better, where you engage with a completely open mind with both of these worlds and try to think, well, what was there in, I don't know, socialist solidarity, or in socialist values, or in thinking about the human in a certain way, and what is there in liberal freedom, in the freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of thought. So these kind of first generation freedoms that people didn't really care in the Marxist world, because they thought this is just for the liberals, and to come up with some kind of synthesis, which I think is a much more productive way of engaging with the societies in which we live now.
And my last question before we open the floor to the audience, one of the concepts of freedom, so it's your father, as we said already, or we didn't, I don't know, was more of a dissident character who I feel bad because I don't know, yeah, people didn't read the book, so I will not explain what your father becomes after transition. But anyhow, let's say he was more of a socialist, dissident kind of character. Your mother, on the other hand, was more like a Fukuyamist, Thatcherist, really believing in liberal democracy. But there is one important character, the most important, I would say, in the book, which is your grandmother and her concept of freedom. Could you tell us a bit more about that concept of freedom, and why is that the concept of freedom you are inclined towards? And also about, I mean, this book just came out in Croatia, but in a few months, your newest book called Dignity will be published, which is a sort of continuation of this book, but it goes back actually to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and tells the story of your grandmother. So could you tell us a bit more about that concept of freedom? Why is it important to you? And just a few words more about the new book.
Yeah, so maybe the best way is actually to start with her and her story, which I started mentioning earlier when I was speaking about the fact that she was the one who taught me French, and she had grown up in this Ottoman elite family in Salonika in the 1920s and 30s, and had experienced the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and the loss of family properties and the rise of the kind of nation states as the new units that were replacing the empire, and then had come to Albania, married. My grandfather was eventually became a political prisoner, and then also survived to see the fall of communism. So she had seen the fall of the empire, the fall of, well, the rise and fall of Nazism and fascism, so Second World War. She had seen the fall of, the rise and fall of communism, and then she saw the kind of birth of the new world. And she was the only person in the 90s that I knew that whenever I asked her, because everyone was talking about freedom and democracy is now here, we're free and so on. Whenever I asked her, so how does it feel to be free now? She always said, well, I was always free. And to me, this was really strange. Already as a child, I remember thinking a lot about it, because it was very weird that this person who had lost all her privileges, I mean, she had grown up in this family where she had servants and a maid, and she literally didn't know how to cook an egg because someone else would do it for her, then had ended up following this husband for 15 years in these God's forsaken communist prisons, lost everything, was a single mother. Her family was all in Greece, so she was completely on her own in Albania. And that she wouldn't see the 90s as this moment of great liberation. She was the paradigmatic victim of communism. And the fact that she wouldn't say, well, now we have freedom, was what kind of intrigued me. And the reason she gave when I asked her was that actually there is a kind of inner freedom that we never lose regardless of what the world does to us. And so she connected this to dignity. In some ways it was connected to also the sense of aristocratic honor, and I then interpret it differently because of my politics, but in her case, there's this kernel of the human that is inner freedom that no society can completely ever take away from you, and that is what enables you to survive and also to criticize whenever you see these appropriations of freedom by institutions around you. So this, I guess, was for me, I then became really interested in this, where this idea came from. I mean, she'd never really read Kant or anything like that, but again, she was not religious. And whenever I asked her, you know, do you believe in God? She would say, God is in my conscience, which when I went back to study Kant back at university, it's kind of what Kant says. She had no idea that Kant also said this. So there was, I suppose, a sort of Enlightenment way of thinking about the human that brought people to the same conclusions, or that made one inspire by the other. But that was, for me, the most important idea of freedom is this notion that freedom is connected to moral agency. It's not about realizing options. It's not about getting your way, because getting your way could always be distorted by others. It could be distorted by ideology, by propaganda. People can shape your preferences in such a way that, you know, they make you think you really want this, you really want to buy this dress. Now, is that really freedom? Someone's convinced you that, and I felt that conception of freedom was slightly more nuanced and slightly more sophisticated in enabling us to create this critical distance between what we are told we really want and we really need, and this second level reflection where you think about it and in a wider way. And that is now, I think, the heart of critical thinking and the heart of efforts to then change society in light of what you want this idea of freedom to be then when it's also realized externally. So we all have it inside us, but what does it mean to live in a world where everyone also lives by these principles?
Thanks a lot. I'm much looking forward to Dignity and the new book, and thanks so much for this conversation. We could go on, but I'm sure there are questions from the audience. So first I would ask you for a big applause, and then finally. Yeah, as usual, just raise the hand and the mic will arrive to you. I can't see any hand yet, so please break the ice. Someone somewhere here in the first row, and then there is another one behind. Yeah, evo može u prvom redu mikrofon. Aha, it's coming from the other side.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to hear you guys discuss about different ideas, but what really caught my attention at the end was this moral socialism that you've mentioned, and as kind of a, as I understood what you said, as a system where that would kind of take the best out of two worlds, out of this consumerism, capitalism, and also from the communism or socialism, where we would have like tighter and stronger connections between ourselves as humans, and taking free speech and these ideas from capitalism, liberalism, whatever. And do you think that this is possible in let's say next 10 years, that we come up to kind of a society that would value these both, the best of both worlds?
Well, in the next 10 years, definitely no. I think in the next 10 years, it's all going to be about survival, actually, and just trying to make sure that we're there, and then we can sort of think about it. But I don't think of politics so the question of whether it's feasible and how soon it's feasible. It can be productive if you're a policy maker, but it can be paralyzing if you're someone who is an intellectual or trying to inject criticism in public debate. Because for me, the question is, what kind of criticism do we need of the society that we live in, from where we are, in the position that we are? And, you know, people have, there's a division of labor. Every one of us has a role to play, you know, doctors, teachers, academics, journalists. In all our daily lives, we are confronted with decisions in which the question of the social system may not be posed as the question of the social system, but is there. So every time, you know, at the university I have to make decisions about funding, about students, about programs. And for me, it's more about having this conception of what this alternative world might be like. It's more of something that is a necessity if you want to live by a certain critical standard, rather than thinking, is the world actually going to be like this? Because I feel that the work of ideas is slow, and you don't really know when they succeed, how they succeed. Sometimes they succeed for the wrong reason. Sometimes, you know, there is a revolutionary situation that no one expected and predicted. And so it's more about actually keeping the flame of thought alive, so that we know where we are with thinking, and we know where we are with our assessment of the circumstances that we live in. And then how that works, it's, you know, whether it succeeds or doesn't succeed, whether it's feasible or not feasible, is neither here nor there, because our point is to live with meaning. And so we just do what we can, and we ascribe this meaning to our lives, and we orient our actions in such a way that we try to make sense of the future as if the future was open. But of course, you know, practically none of us knows. You know, you could get out of here and be killed by a car, and that nothing matters in a way. So it's more about, what do we need in public life to think about the world in a way that makes sense? And I feel that the kind of capitalist societies that we live under, the ways we talk about preferences, the kind of culture around us, is forcing us into ways of thinking that are actually not really compatible with what it means to be human and what it means to live a meaningful life. They're profoundly alienating. And so we need to somehow have to fight this alienation, and to fight that alienation, we need a horizon of thought that keeps us going.
And to fight.
Thank you. I saw a question. Yes, there. Please keep your hand raised. I mean, they saw you. Yeah, it's coming.
Thank you. I was wondering, I'm still thinking about when you were talking about the cover, and you talked about the fact that your neighbors had the key to your apartment. And you mentioned that you lived in Germany, now you live in London. And I was wondering, I know that those countries from experience living in London. It's not really something you do. And I think most capitalist countries, you know, your neighbors are not likely to have the keys to your front door, and you don't have that sense of community. I was wondering what, coming from that communist regime, what your experience was of being met with a vastly different approach to interpersonal relationships and like a sense of community.
Yeah, I mean, so this was anecdotally, this was actually very interesting for me when my mother came to visit from Albania. So my mom's lived mostly in Albania. She spent some time in Italy as well, but Italy is kind of close enough on this front that it's not so different, whereas England is really different when it comes to community and neighborly relations. And for me, I remember my mom had come and she was looking after my son, who was then 1 year old. And at one point I went home and neither she was there nor the baby was there. And then she came back and she didn't have the baby. And I was like, where's the baby? She said, oh, I just left him with the neighbors. I had never known the neighbors. I had no idea what they were called. I had no idea what kind of family they were. And that was the point where I felt like I had kind of integrated in the West because I was really shocked and disturbed and annoyed by this. And I was like, how do you go? And my mom said, oh, they're very nice people. They have 5 children. So she knew everything about the neighbors. It turned out that in the time in which I'd been working and my mom was looking after the baby, she had also socialized with the neighbor and just kind of approached them in accordance with community norms that were completely normal in Albania, but not at all normal in London. And it turned out the neighbors also really welcomed this because nobody had ever gone to the neighbors to say, would you look after this baby for an hour while I go and do some shopping? And they really loved this. This was, you know, they kept talking about this for years. So in a way, I think in the end, we don't know what we're missing, is my point. And somehow, you know, you integrate in these societies which are run by certain values, and the values are completely normalized. And yet, actually, they don't really make anyone happy. And certainly, you know, you don't feel like you're recognized, that there is an alternative way of living, that it's not there now for you. But when you're exposed to it, then you realize that, yes, there's something here that is worth recovering and is worth thinking about. What kind of world would be one that is compatible with this way of thinking about neighborhood and community? And yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I can see a question here. Sorry if I didn't see you, but we still have time. I'll see you at some point. But I saw you first. So, and another one. But the mic is going somewhere. So it's democracy. No. Okay. They choose. Evo, gospođa u drugom redu je prva, ali može i gospodin kako god vi odlučite. Aha, ok, evo. I onda smo vidjeli gospodina na ljevom, a onda ćemo i na balkon ako neko ima u lože.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure and honor having you with us here. I've read the book in English, therefore this was a very nice way of getting again into the book throughout your words. I'm very curious to know in which language was the book written, because I have, not as the politicians, but since I've read the book, I've been giving the book everywhere in any languages that I find, and I'm very keen to read it in Croatian now, but my husband read it in German, I read it in English, and basically we don't find very nearby with each other when we talk about the book, so please do tell us which was the language that you wrote it.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the authorized translations are the German, the French, the Spanish, and the Italian. So these are the ones that I've actually checked the translation, and I think are very, very good translations. The other ones I couldn't read, and so I don't know what the translations are like. I only go by what the readers tell me. I think I've heard very good things about the Croatian one as well, so I hope it's going to be a good experience. I wrote the book because it started, as I said, as an academic book. I started writing it in English. And then I discovered that when I went and tried to write about people, it was very hard to write in English, because when you wanted to convey emotional experiences and memories from childhood, these people were speaking Albanian. So I basically wrote the first draft in English, translated in Albanian, then went back and revised in English after the Albanian. And I had done the same with my other book now about my grandmother. It's the same process. So the two official versions are English and Albanian. The first one was English, but then, as I say, the Albanian one influenced back the English, and the process was, it kind of drives my editors mad, because it's really hard when I go back and say, no, actually I've rewritten a whole 2 pages after I've translated in Albanian. But the choice was determined partly by this idea of recovering memories and talking about feelings and things that you only experience in your native language. It's really hard to write in a completely different language that is the language of work. And the other reason was that I did the Albanian translation myself was that I didn't really want to be a writer that gets translated in their own country. So otherwise it would have felt like it was a kind of appropriative, exploitative approach to the culture, where you go there and you take everything and you write in this dominant imperial language, and which gets translated and is the translation from which most other languages take the text. And so I made a lot of effort with the Albanian one as well. So.
Well, then I have to read it in Albanian too. Thank you.
Thanks. Evo pitanje. Oh, the mic is there already. Thanks.
Okay, so Lea, so great to have you again in Rijeka. The second time, it's a great privilege. Last time, however, I heard you in Berlin. It was also a major event, so it's always so fantastic having the opportunity and the privilege to see you and to listen you speaking. I would come to a question related to what you say, social democratic, as being too limited to be, in fact, a realistic opportunity. In the context where social democracy itself thinks its context. And what you are saying today, interestingly, reminded me a few years ago when Paul Krugman, the economist, was here in Croatia and expressed very similar thoughts to you by saying that he has two nightmares in his life. One is to be the president of the university, what we call the rector, and second, the prime minister of a country like Croatia. He says, in both cases, great responsibility, but not enough power to do what you think. But my question, coming to this, how to say, pessimistic view, could you think that maybe the problem is not so much, okay, not only, delete, forget, not so much, not only in social democracy as such, but in the social democrats. In the sense that my impression is that it's years and years that they are not thinking social democratically from the standpoint of socio-economic justice. And the last time I found inspiration for this thought is from a rap singer from the suburbia of Milano, when he was saying, you are all time speaking about diverse identities and rights from this standpoint. At the end, coming at the academic level, it seems that on the leftist agenda dominating are what are the dominating issues for socioeconomically privileged people in American campuses. So could one of the problems be that there are no social democratic leaders thinking with a set of mind oriented to social economic question, and that it's these that give space to the populist leaders? Just one last sentence, I apologize if I'm too long. So, for example, it's very frequent to take, if you are a white man, by this same fact, you are a privileged person. But I imagine Daniel Blake or all these characters in Ken Loach films really rather angry when living like they live, and then also hearing that they are privileged by the same fact of their identity. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think I agree with you that there is definitely, that's one issue, is the abandonment of this, what I call the kind of diagnosis of the problems of the world that goes along socioeconomic lines, which is what I was saying to Srećko. For me, is the greatest insight that comes from the socialist tradition, is to say, look, history is in the end developing, not and going one way or another, not because you have these reified cultures that fight each other, but just because the socioeconomic circumstances and the political circumstances evolve, and it's from an understanding of this intersection of politics as economics and economics that we see where we are and we can detect patterns in history. And I think it's connected in part to the tragedy of social democracy in the 20th century, that they abandoned this critique of capitalism as a global phenomenon, and they decided to put all their eggs into the nation-state basket, thinking that it's all about giving rights and creating a system of rights and duties for the workers of a particular nation state. So that meant that emancipation only went via rights, basically, via membership. So that's one problem. The second problem is, I think, the fall of the Berlin Wall that, again, consolidated a certain narrative whereby anything that is transnational and transcultural, that is capitalism, is fine as an ideal. And then you have to think about the failures of these different particular units within this broader framework that are the nation states. And every failure is explained by an internal failure. So, you know, you have states that are corrupt, that are not sufficiently civilized, that are not doing enough to liberalize, that are not doing enough to kind of adopt certain rights, liberal rights and duties. And if only they could fix themselves domestically, then the system as a whole is fine. So I think this is the gain, in a way, and the triumph of liberal capitalist thinking and cultural ways of approaching the world, because it's convinced everyone that in terms of how we think about the global economy, there is nothing beyond capitalism. Everything is played at the nation-state level, and therefore everything becomes a question of membership, and therefore it becomes really important to police the boundaries of these members, you know, to decide who belongs, who doesn't belong, who is in, who is out. So identity becomes the key to diagnosing the problems of the world. And once identity becomes the key to diagnosing the problems of the world, it's not really a surprise that the right wins, because the right is really good at policing identities, much better than the left. So I think, as I say, it's a combination of the trajectory of social democracy in the 20th century and the fact that it was interpreted mainly as a nation-state project on the one hand, and the collapse of the only transnational project of emancipation that was an alternative to capitalism, which was socialism, and the aftermath and the kind of fallout from that.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question, which will be that one in the middle of the room. And just to remind you, after the event, Lea will be down there at the foyer signing books if you want a dedication or buy the book.
Hi.
I don't get any percentage for it. I just want you all to read the book. Yeah, please.
Hi, yeah, I would sign that. Read the book. It's amazing. I bought it actually in Albania when I was on vacation there. So I read it in English last summer. I was trying to write a review for myself for the book. And there was just one sentence, how I summarized it, and that is that the political is personal and the personal is political. And that would be my summary of the book. And as you put it, there's a big H and there's a small h. And living in, you know, I grew up in the 90s in Croatia. My sisters were born in the 70s. So I really lived also a part of some of the things that you were writing. And some of them felt similar to the experiences, like, you know, immigration and unsanctioned guns on the street and violence and, you know, economic hardship. And it was like, okay, these aren't the same countries, and yet it's the same. So I was thinking about how to kind of preserve the personal, the small h, when the big history is happening, and it kind of the big things shrink your personal experiences, or they determine them to such level that they stop being individual. And I was really, you know, thinking about that a lot after reading the book. And I felt almost disheartened in the second part of your book when you were writing about your own experiences as an adolescent in Albania. And it almost felt like the free name of the book was ironic in a way, because how can you be free when all of this big H is happening around you and not really letting you be an individual? So I was just wondering, you know, I kind of also got the idea that your answer to that was to leave, just physically remove yourself from that that big age that was happening around you. So this isn't a question, more of a commentary, and I'm just wondering if I got it wrong. And what's your thought on the balance between the little and the big H.
Yeah, I mean, no, you didn't get it wrong. And it certainly, your words remind me that one of my most common experiences, so it's really interesting presenting, this is what goes back to where we started actually with Srećko, asking me, you know, when you talk so many times about the book with different audiences, is it the same conversation and do you get bored? And this actually reminds me of one of the things that I always notice when I present the book in former communist countries and in non-communist countries, so Western sort of liberal capitalists. And one of the biggest differences is that whenever I present it in a kind of post-communist context, it's always personal for everyone. There's clearly something that resonates from the book with everyone's experience, regardless of whether it was Uzbekistan or Croatia or Serbia or Albania or Romania. There was definitely a kind of socialist and post-socialist upbringing that had these features that, again, going back to the question of culture, aren't really reducible to language or to national belonging or to identity. There was just a way of being socialized in the world with certain values and certain ways of thinking and certain categories that were the way how you framed the world, and that's what kind of resonates. But what resonates is also what makes, in the end, the reading experience, I've noticed, really depressing, because there is also this sense of complete dissatisfaction and disenchantment with the world, and a collapse of faith that is very disheartening, where you discuss this experience of freedom in places where actually two types of freedom both have shown themselves to be illusions. And so it's almost like, you know, where do you go? My friends in the West are much more lucky because, you know, they always believed in socialism and they never had it, and so they can continue to believe in it. So they can have this kind of idea that something is worth rescuing and fighting for. And my friends in the East, it's the opposite. The thing that is the hardest to reckon with is the cynicism and the nihilism that this leaves you with, because you feel like, well, what do I do? You know, where do I go? I tried this, I tried this, I tried that, and so now here I am on my own. I can completely understand the world. I can talk to people who see it my way, and we hear each other, but where do we go from there? And I don't know that I have an answer for that kind of works for everyone. What saved me in the end was actually, it's weird to say philosophy and Kant and the Enlightenment. It was almost as though I've managed to kind of recreate a type of faith that is really necessary to preserve in humanity if you want anything to make sense. You know, we can't go on living thinking that it's all so terrible and it's all so bleak and we can't do anything about it. It's almost as though I always say hope is a moral duty. And this was also Václav Havel, I think, said something like this, where he says, what is hope? Hope is not the world going the way you want it to go. In fact, you have to have hope exactly when it's not going that way, because that's when your action is necessary, and that's where your positioning yourself in a certain way is necessary. And so hope is actually not a state of the world. It's not something that anything out there will give you. Nothing has to go well for you to keep your hope. It's a state of the mind, and the more, paradoxically, the worse things are, the more hopeful you have to stay, because that's when you're most needed. And this is, I think, the thought that carries me and makes me maybe just a little bit different when I confront myself with my friends who are just completely hopeless and very nihilistic and very pessimistic, and it kind of annoys me, and I'm like, come on guys, you know, we give meaning to our lives, you know, we have children, we have families, we have friends, we have relationships that we value, and we don't live as though they don't matter. And so this pessimism, we have to act against it and do something about it in some way or other.
Thanks so much. I think this is a great final note. Thanks a lot.
Go back and come back. Huh?